Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight, both in person and virtually, for the special Theory to Practice program, Antiracist. My name is Justin Jacobs. I'm the Alumni Community Engagement Manager at Evans School. It's truly an honor to be here with you all to this important and timely topic. Before we begin, I want to start by acknowledging those English people who land we study and work here at the University of Washington, but ancestors have resided here since time immemorial, and they continue to live in this place to deeply rooted in their cultural traditions. We also acknowledge that this country was built from the land that and genocide of indigenous communities, things we've met forcefully. But I know these acknowledgements are small in gesture, but in making them, we recognize our responsibility to learn and share the system and to build relationships where together we can create an opportunity for more justice. In that spirit, I'm bringing in today's topic for a Theory to Practice event. This evening will focus on anti-racism by design, reimagining applied behavioral science, co-authored by Crystal Hall and Mindy Hernandez, which explores the intersection of behavioral science and equity in public policy. We hope this conversation deepens your understanding of anti-racism and offers tangible ways to incorporate these principles into your work. A quick rundown of tonight's program. We'll start with a conversation between Crystal Hall and Charmila Ajmera, followed by an audience Q&A. For those in person, please hold your questions until the Q&A portion at the end. When the time is right, please raise your hand, and our moderators, Wendy, will come around to you. For our virtual attendees, please feel free to submit questions through the Zoom Q&A feature at any time. Our host team will ensure they are included during the Q&A section at the end. We will collect any resources discussed in today's event, and we'll share those out after the event. Now, let me introduce our incredible speakers. Crystal Hall joined the Evans School faculty in 2008. Her courses include quantitative analysis, psychology of policy analysis, intergroup relations of public policy, and race and equity for policy and governance. Her research explores decision-making in the context of poverty using the methods of social and cognitive psychology, along with behavioral economics. This work has had particular focus on financial decisions making and economic opportunities for low-income families. In addition to broadening the theoretical understanding of behavior of this population, her work has also explored new ways of incorporating these insights into policy design and implementation. She has a record of serving government agencies at the local, state, and federal level, including having served as a fellow on the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team and the Federal Office of Evaluation Sciences at the General Services Administration. Professor Hall holds an appointment as an adjunct associate professor of psychology at the University of Washington's Department of Psychology. She also is an academic affiliate of Ideas 42, an affiliated scientist of Behavioral Change for Good initiatives, and a faculty affiliate at both University of Washington's West Coast Poverty Center and Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. In addition to her scholarly work, Professor Hall has provided guidance and training to community organizations, nonprofits, and government agencies seeking to implement tools from psychology and behavioral economics into the design and delivery of their programs and services. She holds a PhD and MA in psychology from Princeton University. In addition, she holds a BS from Carnegie Mellon University and both decision services and policy and management. Now, Charmila Ajmera is an environmental justice policy senior manager in the Environmental Public Health Division of the Washington State Department of Health. Prior to joining the agency, she worked with the Environmental Justice Coalition front and center to help draft and pass the 2021 Healthy Environment for All Act and served as an inclusion manager at Tableau and Salesforce. She has been a staunch and effective advocate for equity and anti-racist policy and practices both in her professional and academic careers for the last 15 years. Outside of work, she loves enjoying the beauty of the PNW and her 2-year-old daughter, partner, and pet. Please join me in welcoming Crystal and Charmy. And Charmy, I will pass it over to you to get us started.
Thank
you for the warm introduction. I'm so happy to be back at the Evans School as an alum, and just thrilled to be having this conversation with Crystal. So just to go ahead and kick us off, so many of you may have not read the book yet. It just came out, still new. And so, Crystal, I was wondering if you could tell us and give us a brief overview of behavioral science and design, how it's used in public policy, and why it's critical to bring an anti-racist approach to this work.
Thank you. I'm going to answer your question, but in a minute. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for being here. This is really surreal for me. It's very exciting. This has been a long process, and it's so exciting to celebrate it and to have a full room. My parents are here, sitting in the front row, and when I was talking to them about how it was full, my mom, without missing a beat, said, "Couldn't they find a bigger room?" But it's really exciting. So thank you all. This is it's so exciting, and I think many of you know me very well, and you know that I don't necessarily look to be the center of attention in this way. So it's exciting, and so I'm really excited to have a conversation first with Charmy, and then with the rest of you. So back to your question. So my field, I'm trained as a psychologist, and I studied, as an undergraduate, I studied public policy and decision science, and really got interested in the way that understanding psychology can help us think about the way we understand, the way we design policy levers for a wide range of social problems. And I got really specifically interested in financial decision making and how we think about strategies to address poverty and inequality. And so that's what led me into graduate school and really led me into this world of applied behavioral science, behavioral economics, behavioral insights. There's a lot of names that we use for it. And really the focus there is about how do we think about the psychological barriers to particular types of behaviors. If we want people to save more money, or we want people to purchase an eco-friendly car, how do we think about those things? And that's really been what my work has focused on for the last 15 years. And in the last several years, and a lot of that due to the influence of a lot of people that are in the room right now, I really started thinking more and more about how do we actually operationalize equity? How do we think about equity in those spaces? And I think the way that I like to explain that is that when we focus on the individual, it becomes very, very narrow, where we're thinking about, again, why people don't engage in certain behaviors. And we often like to talk about that through what we call an intention and an action gap. And a way that I like to explain that is there's this alarm. Has anybody heard of the alarm clock called Clocky? Anybody that's taken class with me has seen the picture of this. It's this alarm clock. It goes off, it rolls off of your table, it makes a lot of noise, you have to get up and you have to go stop it, right? And there's no rational reason why anybody should need that. You set your alarm, and then you get up when your alarm goes off. But we all know that the person that sets the alarm isn't the same person that experiences it when you wake up in the morning. And so this is this tool, and it really is, I think, directly tied to behavioral insights about, okay, how do we bridge this gap between what I intend to do and what I actually do when the time comes for me to do it. And that's really useful, but the problem with that is that it doesn't acknowledge the other forces that are at play. And in the book, we're of course exploring racism, structural racism. We can think about that with other types of equity as well, but really this focus being, how can we acknowledge individual psychological barriers, whether it's that intention action gap or something else, but then how can we look at how that operates in a context that's a lot more complicated, that extends beyond the behavior of any individual person?
Thank you for that explanation. And I personally really appreciated the book and the insights that you share in it. I work in the field of public health at the state level. I also work on environmental justice policy, environmental issues. And it's one thing to think you have a strategy to change someone's decisions in a public health context or an environmental context, and another thing to match that with the reality on the ground, when you actually talk to real people in real communities and say, well, I have this assumption about why you're not changing this particular behavior for public health. And then they're like, what? Like, you clearly have no understanding of my lived experience or some of the structural barriers that I face. So I really appreciated that, especially the public health examples in the book itself. So as a second question, a follow-in, we don't have Mindy, your co-author, here with us today, but I am curious, as you and Mindy were conceptualizing and writing the book, who did you have in mind as your audience, and how do you hope readers will use the research and guidance that you have in the book?
Yeah, so I think initially we wrote a short piece that was published in an online space called The Behavioral Scientist, and we wrote that out of some just frustration we started writing it in the summer of 2020, so I don't need to give you the context of what was happening. And Mindy being someone who I've known since I was a graduate student, and a lot of the things we were talking about that summer were things that, the things that the field was talking about and things that the world was talking about were things that she and I had talked about for years and years. And we had this moment of, maybe this is something we can talk about in our particular community. And that eventually turned into what became the proposal for the book. And I will say, when we started talking about who we hoped would read it, I really thought a lot about my students. That was one of the first audiences that I thought about. And I, we talk a lot about this work, and I have found over the years that some of the best reflections on the work that I've had have been from being challenged in the classroom by students as to how can we really take this and apply it in this world that's not a psych lab, that's a lot messier, right? And so that was one reflection that we had initially. And then there's really two more groups. One of them are my academic colleagues and collaborators, and those of us that are trained in these methods, but often use them in these spaces that are a little sterile, for lack of a better term, right? And so really trying to challenge my academic colleagues to think a little bit bigger in terms of how the work that we do really is useful outside in a different context. And then the third group are the partners and the growing partners and collaborators that I have that are not academics. So I've spent a lot of time working with the federal government. I've worked with state and local government as well. And really often, I think there has been this pattern of people get very excited about this idea that behavioral insights can provide this very easy to use set of strategies to try to create behavior change, but really wanting to challenge those folks to think more deeply about how we have to be careful in how we do that, how we have to be more nuanced in how we do that. And I have to say, this is, a lot of the ideas really relate to other ideas, again, of folks that I've worked with over the years. So I keep looking at Innes, because Innes is somebody else who's been an amazing thought partner in thinking about this. And she and I have written about this as well. Just really wanting to think about how do we responsibly use this, and then at the end of the day, make it more effective. And so that was what motivated us, and those were the audiences that we had in mind.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, both as like a practitioner, as a former student, and then my experience in academia, particularly at the Evans School. A big part of my team here was actually working very closely with Crystal and the administration and other students to really think about how can we bring an anti-racist perspective, an equity perspective more into the curriculum of public policy work, so that when we go into the field and we're confronting the realities of working with very diverse communities and populations who every single day bump up against those systemic barriers that you talk about in the book, how can we meaningfully engage with them? How can we see and understand and acknowledge those barriers and actually work in partnership to create policy solutions that like actively work to dismantle, or at a minimum address, those structures of racism and inequity that we see? And so like really appreciate that we're like exactly who you had in mind as you wrote the book. And I took a lot out of it as I was reading it, like literally taking notes of like, how can my team and I implement some of those strategies at the Department of Health in the policy work that we're doing. So yeah, mission accomplished. Audience. So another question, and this is a little selfish because I'm like in the middle of this right now, but one of the core arguments that you and Mindy make in the book is the importance of engaging with community. especially BIPOC folks who have lived experience with whatever it is that the given subject is, that behavioral scientists like yourself, policymakers, are engaging with and trying to solve for in some way. Can you talk more about the mechanics of this, and specifically how practitioners can avoid being extractive in our relationship with communities, right? There's often this interaction of like, well, I'm here for this specific thing, and this is what I want from you, and I'm going to take it and then go do some policy stuff and talk to some other people about it. And like, you're just here for a small role versus deep, meaningful partnership with community members, because they're actively involved in this. They're impacted by the policy decisions we make. We can have a large role in that partnership and affecting outcomes for different communities. So I'm curious how you and Mindy have seen that play out and how you thought about it in the context of behavioral science.
Yeah, this is an important one, because I think this is a space where, as we were researching and thinking and writing, we really felt like there was so much that the field of applied behavioral science could learn from other fields. And that this was a space where for psychologists, for people that do this work, the idea of community engagement was, maybe we do a focus group, kind of, maybe we do some, like, we call it desk research, where we try to look at, what does it take to apply to a program. And it really was not something that we invested significant time, effort, money in. And I to be fair to us, there's often not a lot of time or money to do that stage, right? You get a grant periods are very short. You have to get out and do the work. Often you have to know what the research question and the plan is before you even get the money to do the work. So there's a lot of, and we talk about this, there's a lot of pieces that are complicated and related to each other. But I think when it comes down to the mechanics of actually doing it, I think there's a couple of things that really have become clear, both as we were researching and as in some of the work that I have going on now, is really acknowledging that, engaging in work on the ground with communities requires a lot of conscious effort. It requires skills that we just don't naturally have. We have to be trained in that. And like, one really great example of that I can give is I work with the Office of Evaluation Sciences at the GSA. I talk about them in the book. I've worked with them on and off for years. And we are doing a project right now where we're looking at how Native tribal governments are engaging with the US federal government in accessing funds tied to COVID recovery. And really trying to understand, like, what are the unique types of burdens faced by those groups. And there's a lot there that we've been slowly unpacking, and we were fortunate enough to be able to push back a little bit on the agency that funded us to say, you have an idea of what the question is, but we don't really know, and we need to talk to people, and we need to do that in a deep, sustained way. We have to build relationships. And we were really fortunate that we got funding, and we've spent now well over a year just trying to figure out what the research questions are and what the appropriate methodologies are to start to understand some of this. And part of that process has been the team hired someone that has the right type of interdisciplinary training to help to lead us in the community engagement work that we've done. And then we also were able to hire a tribal engagement fellow. And this is somebody who actually has lived experience, who has the technical experience, and has been able to come in and support us on how we communicate with these folks and how we think about translating these really high level research questions to the actual practice of working in these communities. And at the end of the day, it takes a lot more time, it takes more resources, but we feel really strongly about it because it's already becoming really clear that where we end up is going to be much more authentic and it's going to actually reflect what the needs are in that community.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciated the examples, the specific examples you gave in your book that also show that you have better outcomes. You have better policy practices, recommendations, like your behavioral, methodologies and suggestions for how to change behavior are more effective because you talk to people and you ask them, like, hey, would this actually work? this thing that we're trying to do, like, would you actually do it differently? Would you change your behavior? And we understand better if the answer is no, what maybe some of the systemic barriers are for the reasons behind that, and also have a more authentic relationship with the communities that are ultimately impacted by the policy decisions that we make. So I really appreciated the very specific examples you gave of like the return on investment of it, like putting in that extra time, that energy, investing in the expertise. And, you know, you talked a lot too about the importance of having a really diverse set of practitioners participate, like the examples that you just gave, who have that lived experience, who can connect really authentically with the community in a way that someone coming in from the outside or from academia can't always do. So yeah, I really appreciated that. And I just want to do a quick time check with Justin. Are we good? Okay, and when do we have to stop for the audience Q&A? 4:35. Oh, okay. I was
Awesome.
great. We got lots of time. All right.
And I want to add just one point to that, because many of you are part of the Evans community, and we're here for Anthony Barrow's visit. He might be on Zoom, I'm not sure. Hi, Anthony, if you're there out in Cyberland. And his work has been so fantastic, because it really has stressed this importance of what you just described, which is people with lived experience that have a connection in whatever space you're looking at. And that's something that has really been a really validating part of us as we were writing and thinking about how to communicate this, is really stressing that is really valuable. And I think in many contexts, people are encouraged to do the opposite and to downplay if they have that type of connection to the work, because there's this idea that it makes you less objective or something, or more something else. And really that is something that we should be more actively valuing in the course of this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a shift that I've started to see more as a practitioner in government as well, is really understanding and valuing people's lived experience. We've placed so much importance on credentials, on letters after your name, on academic experience, which is really important, like not to downplay that at all, that there's an incredibly important set of skills that come out of that type of educational investment. And it shouldn't diminish the lived experience that people have, the expertise that you have of actually living through something, of knowing how it plays out in your community, of understanding the impacts of policy decisions on the ground, not just sort of in theory, but like actually in practice, right? Theory to practice. See what I did there? So I really appreciate that. And I love that I'm seeing that more in academic literature, that I'm seeing that more in the public policy context, because just for my few years working in the government, especially coming from the community advocacy side of the work, I'm like, literally, how do y'all do this without community? Like, how do you do anything effectively? And sometimes the answer is you don't. And we end up where we are with some of those structural barriers that we have.
You do something, but it's not.
Yeah, but it's not always the thing you're trying to do, or it reinforces institutional racism in some of the ways that you also talk about in the book. So I really love that. And who knows, maybe there'll be a community engagement course at Evans at some point. I would have loved to have taken that course when I was a student, and would really have benefited from it now in my current role as we're learning on the job. All right, so I'll move to my next question. I don't think I've given this out yet, to be totally honest. I'm on a steep learning curve. But there are lots of other very smart people from Evans who I'm working with currently who are very good at it. So maybe it could be a collective effort. All right, so for probably a final question, because this is a juicy one, I'm curious, given the current political context that we're in, particularly at the national level, and that we see playing out across the nation at various levels of governance and culture, how do you think anti-racist behavioral design might be used most effectively moving forward?
Yes, important question. It's somewhat the elephant in the room. It was a little interesting to have this book come out right after the the presidential election. I think the first thing I'll say is that I think we have already talked about this a little bit, but this work makes the work better, right? I think, period. And if we can more effectively understand the context in which we are designing policies and programs for, we will do a better job of achieving our goals, right? There's obviously a lot in there. There's a lot of caveats, but I think that's really important. And sometimes it's about understanding the context better. Sometimes it's about actually making sure that everyone's on the same page about the definition of the problem. But I think it makes the work better, right? At the end of the day, I came across a term, and I wrote it down because I just came across it today, because I am still working in the federal government right now. Part of my time is this idea of cultural translation and taking our portfolios of work and thinking about how we translate them for the new administration, which I thought was a really interesting choice of words. And really thinking about how are agencies taking their portfolios and moving them into the new administration. And I have to say, I've worked with OES for years. It's coming up on 10 years, and I've worked on many projects with them. And one of the things that I will say is that some of the most exciting work that I've done actually was during the Trump administration. And so when COVID happened, I got to work on a project looking at equity in the way that funds were being distributed to small businesses. And it was really great. And we had a lot of discretion. And I think we did some very good work. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to do this work and still do a lot of good, because it genuinely isn't just about the buzzwords. And like, now we have to be a little more careful with the language that we use. I mean, we always had to be careful, but I think there are different ways we have to be careful with the language, but I don't think it changes the underlying thread of what we're trying to do, which is understand the populations that we're serving and find ways to most effectively meet what they need, and identifying the people that are at, the most risk of being underserved. And so I think that thread continues, and I feel really confident that thread is continuing at all levels of government. I think there's just, on some level, we have to be mindful about how we communicate it, how we talk about it, right? And fortunately, as a social psychologist and a behavioral scientist, framing is something that we're really good at. And like, what do we call the thing that we're doing, right? And so I feel optimistic, because I do think that there is, I spend so much time talking with people in the federal government, and there is this desire to do good. And whether or not we call it equity or diversity or inclusion or whatever, I think that the idea of just trying to serve people, I think that is real, that's there. And so I feel optimistic.
I love that you feel that way. And I'm gonna just hold on to that over the next couple of years as a policy practitioner. But no, I do genuinely appreciate that. And as we were talking about this previously, I was also reflecting, I started as a student at Evans in 2017. And throughout my tenure at Evans and then the years since, I mean, so much of the anti-racist and equitable policy work that I've done was during the first Trump administration. There was a similar political atmosphere, similar sort of reaction to like using those words of anti-racism and equity. And we see that resurging again now, particularly even prior to this last administration in the wake of 2020. There was like the strong leaning in, and then the whoa, we leaned too far in, and now we're scared. But as a result of that, I think a lot of people did get engaged and are thinking differently about this work, and that we can be really thoughtful and conscious about the language we use about it, and maybe use some of the behavioral science techniques to bring people into the work who maybe wouldn't otherwise. If we're thoughtful and we're sensitive and curious, and we focus on what you said, on just doing that good work.
Yeah, I think I feel optimistic, but that's not the only emotion that I feel. So I'll be very clear about that. But I do, there's a lot of optimism there. And I think also, if we want to call it backlash, I don't know if that's too strong or not strong enough of a word, but if we want to call it back, like that was happening already. And whether or not some of the big outcomes are reflections of that, or think like, I don't know what the relationship, but that was in the water. And I think just being realistic about the fact that maybe people are feeling a little more cautious about how we talk about this, I think is worth acknowledging, because I think it's not just reflected at the national level. I think that's showing up in a lot of places. And so I think it's worth acknowledging that too.
Absolutely. And I'll just say before we transition to the audience Q&A, I think maybe your book came out at like the perfect time. Actually, it's like, it's going to be even more important, especially for those of us in policy, working with community, working on these really large structural systemic issues at the policy level, to be able to learn and turn to tools and practices and guidance like what you and Mindy put together as we navigate a rapidly changing political and policy landscape at every single level of government. So I think it was actually maybe really, this was like our gift to like fortify us who are really engaged in this work on the day-to-day as we navigate the next several years and what comes after it. So thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and I think transition to audience Q&A. And so I think if you'd like my mic, or I can give you, musical mics.
All right.
Yeah. And then if folks want to raise their hands, go ahead.
Thank you. I really love that question. What's that?
Can you repeat it for the people on?
Oh, right. Hi. Yes. Okay. Yes. How do we increase the numbers of people with lived experience in public policy? Is that fair? Yes. Thank you. So I think, honestly, I think that starts at places like the Evans School and the work that we're doing to really try to create a pipeline of people with the commitment to public service that want to go out and do this work, and trying to understand what are the barriers for folks to come into this work. Is it about people not feeling like it's for them? Is it about there are a lot of structural barriers for people to come and live and go to school in this part of the country. There's a lot to unpack there, to think about how can we create future leaders that are diverse on a number of dimensions to go forward. And so I think that's something, separate from the research side of my work, that I think about a lot in my role here at the Evans School, is how do we create more spaces for that? And I do think there's a lot of good work being done to try to think about those pathways, but I think that's really one of the biggest ways that we can start to get there. Because I also think we have to, we need folks to understand the systems as they are, in my opinion, before we try to change them. And even if we feel like they have to be completely changed, right? And I think that a place like the Evans School is a place where we can find this balance of bringing people in and helping them understand these systems so that then they're ready to go forward and change them. And to do that, we need, all types of people with all types of backgrounds here. So thank you. I appreciate the question. Question online? Okay.
What are your thoughts on an intersection of your work and climate change?
Yes, I think as much as we might not want to acknowledge it, I think probably there's not a person in this room that doesn't do work that intersects with those spaces. I think that, I think as a behavioral scientist, I wonder a lot about how can we more effectively get people to understand, how do we communicate in a way that will help to make people feel the urgency in this problem. And it's something that I think behavioral scientists have struggled with, and others, many folks have struggled with, but I think that's the first thought that comes to mind. And then I also just think that when we think about it from an equity standpoint, recognizing that, many of the people that are experiencing the impacts are not the people that are the worst perpetrators of the problem. I'm looking at my friend and colleague who knows a lot more about this than me, sitting in the front row. But I would say I think as psychologists, I think it really is about like how are we communicating to this so that people even understand the problem and keep it at top of mind, because I think there are often a lot of other problems that make it that bubble up to the top first. And I think, so Mindy works for WRI, the World Resources Institute, and this is the work that she's doing every day, is really bringing this behavioral science lens to these questions. They do work around the world, and I think it's something that behavioral science has not been as effective. I think we've been more effective at trying to understand why people don't, and less effective at trying to figure out how to do a better job. And I think when you intersect that with some of these equity considerations, it makes it even more urgent. And so it's something that I've been thinking about much more over the years. I'm losing them. Sorry. I knew it. But really trying to think about how we can communicate that and how we can prioritize the research questions that potentially have the most impact. And I think doing that with this more intersectional lens, I think, is hopefully a way to get there. But yeah, it's a big one. And I think also I would say, the last thing I'll say, as a psychologist, I think what I notice in the applied behavioral science community is that there's so many people that think that their work, they're doing important work, but it's something different, and they're not finding the overlap with those things. And I think that's really, that's a problem. Charmy, I want to know what you think about this question, actually.
That's very kind. I have a lot of thoughts about it. I work in the environmental justice and climate justice space. So I work on environmental and energy issues in various capacities. So I agree with everything that you said. And I think another place that I'm especially thinking about behavioral science as a policy tool is obviously there's a lot of work to be done at the policy level to address the root causes of the climate crisis and the impacts of the climate crisis. But then, especially on the local level, it's how do we prepare? How do we make communities climate resilient, particularly those communities, often BIPOC communities, often in the global South, that are bearing disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis? And even, in our own community in Seattle and King County and Washington State, as we're dealing with wildfires and smoke and all of these various impacts of the climate crisis, thinking about behavioral change and how do we prepare our homes? How do we keep our bodies safe when there's really rampant wildfire smoke? How do we protect our neighbors who may be unhoused? And what are the policy choices that we can make to help move them indoors and give them safe spaces that they feel welcome, that they can bring their community, that they can bring their pets during wildfire smoke events? Like there's all of the, how do we influence some of those behavioral choices, those individual choices at a policy level, thinking about the systemic barriers that people have just to keep people safe and the immediate impacts of the climate crisis. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the work that I do. And that's a direct connection that I see to some of the work that you and Mindy are doing and that you're talking about, in addition to helping people understand what those root causes of the climate crisis are, and then thinking about larger systemic policy changes for maybe how do we just reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How do we do less to stop making it worse? And then how do we meaningfully impact some of those immediate effects of it that are leading to extreme weather events like the hurricanes we've seen, the wildfires that are late season in California? So a lot of intersections in the work.
Okay. Oh, I love that question. Yes, sorry. Distinctions, how this could be used in distinctions between designing policies versus designing programs. Does that capture it right, Heather? Is that good? Okay, thank you. So let's see. I think so much of what I have spent my time thinking about has been more at the program level, I would say, and really trying to understand how we are designing the implementation of often a policy to one particular program. And I think what I would say is that I think when we think about designing a policy, I think it's a different level of understanding context in terms of how you're defining a problem, right? And so you're trying to make sense of how some particular community is potentially impacted by something, right? Whether it's like poverty or a pandemic or something, and you're trying to think about, you know, how this institution can have an impact on that, which feels like a very different level of understanding the role of systems and structures than thinking about any individual program, right? Where then you're really operationalizing it at a much more granular level. I think at the core, I think they would be very similar, because in both cases, we need to make sense of what's the experience of the people that are most impacted, and how does understanding that translate to what we decide that the solution needs to be, or the implementation of the solution. So I think the actual process of engaging in that would look really potentially different for the two, but I think at the core, I think the lessons would translate. But it's a really interesting question. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So the question was, how do we engage with communities, Black communities in particular, when they are probably very tired or reached out to? That's a great question. I think it's a tough one. I think it's a little context dependent, right? And I think it depends on like what level you're talking about and what the engagement is. I think, you know, reflecting, this is a different community, but your question is making me reflect on the work that I'm doing now with the Native governments. And I think the biggest thing that we really tried to communicate, because this was another situation where, you know, we started out, our engagement was with leaders from these governments, and they have been reached out to a lot by the federal government about like, what has your experience been? And they, you know, they very rightfully so, there's a lot of eye rolls there about, okay, I mean, again, like, are you really going to listen? And so we really tried to communicate what our perception of the potential value would be to them, and why what we were doing was different. And luckily, I think we were able to authentically offer them something different, to say, this is why we think this effort is going to be more effective. And so I think communicating to people the why, and why it's going to be beneficial, and why it's going to be different. And, you know, of course, along the way, like being really respectful of people's time and whatever that means in a particular context, but being really mindful of that, and being really transparent about what the potential benefits would be to both parties, right? To say that, you know, we are trying to learn something potentially, but here's why we think that would be important to you and your community. And I will also say, with this project, just the process of going through that, it really helped us reflect on, like, there were moments where we thought, okay, we're curious about this thing. What can we learn without going out to these communities again? And there were moments where we decided, you know what, we can wait. We don't need to. And this is even just like at the level of, am I going to email this busy person and ask them this question? Or am I going to try harder to figure it out myself first? And so I think that it's true at that level, but also at a higher level too. And just like really maintaining this mindfulness for how those communities often are so burdened and don't, you know, want to give you time and space with very good reason. But I appreciate the question. And it's hard, and on some level easier said than done, I think.
All right. Well, let's give a big round of applause